Bibliophiles of the internet, the 16th round of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon is come and gone, and now it's time for me to finally wrap up the books I read during that week. I'm starting to think that something is seriously wrong with me, at least by my own standards, keywords, because I somehow read 11 books over the course of that one week. To put that in perspective for you, that's as many books as I read in the entire month of February, and more books than I read in the entire month of April. So again, within the context of my own habits, that is absolutely wild by any metric. I'm gonna try to keep this as informative but also as streamlined as it can possibly be. Famous last words, I know. I will be noting which reading prompts each book fulfilled, and you'll see my completed bingo board at the end of the video. But for now, let's get started with the first book I finished, which was Metal from Heaven by August Clark. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Vico Ortiz. This is pitched as a bloody lesbian revenge tale. It's set in a sort of alternate fantasy version of the Industrial Revolution, except the most valued commodity is this magical metal known as ichorite. Ichorite is mined in largely unethical ways, and it's also highly toxic, which makes for very dangerous working environments, and that's why when the story begins, Marnie and her family are protesting working conditions and other human rights violations committed by industrialist Jan Chauncey, the wealthy owner of the ichorite mines. But that protest is disrupted when the protesters are suddenly massacred on the orders of Jan Chauncey, and everyone but Marnie is brutally killed. A decade later, Chauncey is searching for a suitable marriage match for his young ward to overtake his empire, and so Marnie decides to pass herself off as an aristocrat, win the ward's affections, and finally exact her revenge. Content warnings for descriptions of massacres and mass death, graphic descriptions of injury and violence, explorations of loss and grief, some use of ableist language, and some sexual content. Listen, this book is pitched as The Princess Bride meets Gideon the Ninth, which honestly is incredibly accurate, but I want to drill down on that even more and say that this book is like The Princess Bride if The Princess Bride were told entirely from Inigo Montoya's point of view, and if Inigo was a badass, swaggering, vengeful lesbian full of wrath. This book has been on pretty much every single one of my monthly TBRs ever since it came out last October, so I definitely had a gut feeling that I would really enjoy it, which turned out to be true, but I was also pleasantly surprised because I didn't realize the story had a sort of Western edge. Again, it's kind of a fantastical alternate history set against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, and it's very much a queer fantasy Western revenge epic or ballad. There are bandits, there are holdups, there are motorcycle riding outlaws, there are train robberies, there are gangs. It has all the rugged, gritty Western trappings you could possibly want. So on a plot level and also aesthetically, I found this to be really compelling. I love the audio experience as well because Vico very beautifully and deftly plays into those rugged Western vibes with their performance. I thought it was just fantastic. The yearning in this story is also absolutely through the roof. The story posits unrequited longing as a form of religion almost, and I love the way that permeates every single part of the story and how everything always comes back to Marnie's desperation to avenge the people she loves. I found this story to be an incredibly brash, bold, reckless, keening cry into the void. It's about the thankless work of future making. It's about living beyond the boundaries of normality and propriety in search of something bigger than ourselves. And most of all, it's about family. It's about the ties that bind us and about creating a world where the people we love, even the ones we haven't met yet, can be valued and protected and safe. And narratively, it takes some pretty fucking big swings at the end. The scope of the story went so much further than I thought it would, and while I think the story could have been structured even more effectively in some ways, I was still very impressed. I do think the world building is a bit clumsy at times, a bit too overwrought and introduced in really info-dumpy ways that don't tend to have any long-term bearing on the story, but even considering that, I still gave this a solid 4 stars. Now, because I technically read most of this book before the readathon started, I decided I wouldn't count it towards any of the prompts. If I had, it would have qualified for the TBR oldie and fantasy spaces, but other books I read fulfilled those prompts anyways, as you'll see, so it kind of doesn't make a difference. After I finished that, I picked up my e-galley of Hollow Magic by Mars Lauterbaugh. This comes out from Fievel and Friends on August 11th, 2026. This is a YA fantasy graphic novel about a young witch known as Rosefinch, who's able to lift curses and manipulate powerful magic. But when a witch's magic is left long enough in the Fey realm where she comes from, it becomes supercharged, painful, and even dangerous to use. She hears a rumor about the abandoned village of Harp, which is said to be home to a powerful witch who might be able to help her control her magic, and that's how she discovers this ruined fortress that's been completely abandoned except for a knight cursed to forever stand guard at the entrance. Content warnings for some references to parental death and grief, and some depictions of injury and thematic violence. I thought this was a really wonderful debut for Mars. In case you don't know, they're an incredibly talented artist who did the covers for Cemetery Boys and the Sunbearer Trials. They've also done a lot of official character art as part of pre-order campaigns and designed some special editions as well. I love their style, their aesthetic, their point of view, and I'm just really glad they're getting a chance to tell their own stories. I really love the feel of this graphic novel. It kind of feels like a fun bottle episode in some ways, in the sense that you definitely get the feeling that this is set in a much broader fantasy world that has all kinds of different facets to it, but it's all kind of funneled into this one mysterious location. And the main thrust of the story is trying to figure out what exactly happened in this place. So I really enjoyed the mystery of the story. I thought the core character group was also really great. You can tell there's depth and weight to their backstories, but their true personalities also get a chance to shine through, and they also get to enjoy moments of levity, which is really nice. Thematically, I also appreciate what the story has to say about how, yes, there is an incredible amount of vulnerability in sharing parts of ourselves with other people, but there's also not insignificant power in choosing to trust other people and choosing to share those parts of ourselves in the first place. Like, yes, people can definitely take the most precious parts of ourselves and weaponize them against us, but putting our trust in other people is also what makes us stronger, and I think that's a great message. Honestly, there's nothing wrong about this debut per se. It does feel a bit unfinished in some ways, but that's only because, again, you can definitely tell that there's so much more to this fantasy world and so many more stories to be told from within it. So I hope we do get even more comics set in this world or following these characters. But again, this was a really solid debut, and I gave it 4 stars. In terms of prompts, this one could count towards both the debut and fantasy space. Then I picked up my arc of According to Plan by Kristen Randall. The author kindly sent me a physical galley themselves, and this one comes out from Simon Teen on February 3rd, 2026. This is a contemporary YA story about a non-binary teenager named Mal who was really excited to be starting off their senior year as editor-in-chief for the school's literary magazine. It's supposed to be the crowning jewel on their college applications, which they really need to stand out because their big plan is to finally get out of their small Midwestern town after they graduate. However, they're informed that the magazine has been shut down due to budget cuts, and now Mal, along with all the other staff members, have to scramble to find some other kind of after-school activity to replace it. That's when one of the staff members, Emerson Pike, Mal's fellow queer fat ADHD haver, suggests that they go rogue and create a zine instead. And even though Mal really wants to be on board, making and selling a contraband publication isn't exactly an above-board activity they can put on their resume, and definitely does not fit into their plan. Content warnings for brief instances of misgendering, some experienced ableism and internalized ableism, brief instances of verbal harassment from a parent, and brief mentions of mental health episodes, including depression and depressive episodes. Also worth noting, Mal is fat, non-binary, bisexual, has ADHD, and is also potentially autistic. The love interest, Emerson, is also fat, bisexual, and has ADHD. I read and loved Kristen's debut, The No Girlfriend Rule, during the last round of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon, so I knew I would most likely enjoy this sophomore novel of theirs as well, and I was absolutely correct. And you know what? I didn't just enjoy it, I thought it was fan-freaking-tastic. Between both of their books, I can say with absolute confidence that Kristen is so great at writing these endearing, thoughtful, nerdy, fun, coming-of-age stories with really dynamic friend groups and a lot to say about living at the intersection of neurodivergency, fatness, and queerness. There's also just a really wonderful sense of warmth and community at the heart of this story. It's very much a love letter to Kentucky, where the story is set, and it does such a great job of celebrating the state's rich counterculture and community spaces. And I would say it's also a tender-hearted love letter to building your own spaces, making your own art, and finding value in doing things for yourself in the ways that work for you and make sense for you. There's more than just one path. There's more than one way to be or to get things done, and the characters are very much figuring out what fulfills them and what propels them towards the goals they make for themselves. I love that this story is showing young people especially the value of carving out space for yourself in the world, pouring yourself into what pours back into you, and doing things not because you're supposed to do them, but because they bring some kind of value to your life. I think that's a really strong through line in the story, this idea that we can accomplish so much more and hold so much more joy in our lives when we learn to think beyond the boundaries and limitations of quote-unquote traditional lifestyles and norms. If we only ever go through the proper channels to get things done or live our lives in a way that other people prescribe for us, there's so much that we miss out on, and we deserve to explore all of life's possibilities, not just the ones that work for the most people. Honestly, I just really enjoyed every single part of this. this. By the end, there was absolutely nothing I would have changed about this story. It's a really beautiful, thought-provoking, quietly resonant story that I highly recommend. I gave it 5 stars. I counted this towards the rainbow flag cover prompt because if you'll look closely, you'll notice that all 3 colors of the bisexual flag are on the cover. And I also counted this towards the season prompt because it's very much a capital F, capital B fall book. After that, I finally got a chance to pick up Canto Contigo by Johnny Garzavia. This is Johnny's most recent YA release. It's a contemporary coming-of-age story with just a pinch of magical realism about a Mexican-American teenager named Rafi who is a proud third-generation mariachi musician, and his high school actually has one of the most competitive mariachi programs where he is the lead singer, and under his leadership, they have pretty much swept first place in every single competition. But Rafi's dad has to take a new job, which forces their family to move to San Antonio and also forces Rafi to change schools, which means he now has to compete for his old school's #1 rival, Mariachi Todos Colores. As if that wasn't bad enough, the group's current lead singer is the super attractive mystery boy that Rafi almost hooked up with at the last national competition. And even though he wants to maybe start something with this guy, he's also going to have to take him down if he wants to reclaim what he sees as his rightful place. Content warnings for grandparent death due to Parkinson's disease and explorations of grief, some depictions of underage drinking, including hangover and vomit, instances of experienced homophobia, transphobia, and racism, and some fade to black sexual content. Also worth noting, the other main character, Rey, is an Afro-Latina trans boy undergoing HRT. There's at least 2 things I know to be true every single time I pick up one of Johnny's books. First off, I'm going to ugly laugh. And secondly, I'm going to ugly feel my ugly feelings. And Canto Contigo proved to be no exception to those rules. Especially as a queer Mexican-American person myself, there is such a special place in my heart for Johnny's stories, which are always celebrations of the Mexican diaspora and our culture. And what I especially love is that the way Mexican-American identity shows up in Johnny's stories is anything but reductive or stereotypical or surface. It's not just the use of language, it's not just the food. Culture is not just a set dressing in the story, but an integral part of the way the characters move through the world, from cultural norms to family dynamics and gender dynamics. There's nuance in the way our culture is represented in a way that I always recognize deeply in my soul as I read their stories, and I love that. And in that same vein, I love that this story is very much a celebration of mariachi music, but at the same time, it's not a romanticization of mariachi music. Mariachi music is very traditional. It has a deep, rich, storied history within Mexican culture, and the story does recognize that and show how mariachi music is a way for these characters to connect with their cultural history, but at the same time, it's acknowledging that part of that history is rooted in anti-indigeneity, racism, colorism, homophobia, transphobia. Those are unfortunately also pillars of that musical tradition that can't and shouldn't be erased. I really respect that part of the story, the part that says that if you love something or someone, you have to recognize all the different parts of it, even the uncomfortable parts. And part of your job in loving that thing or that person is committing to making it better and stronger through your love. I also appreciate how Johnny gives their characters space to be messy, to grieve, to make mistakes, to hurt other people and even themselves, because that is very much the reality of growing up. Growing into the person you're meant to be is messy. It's not linear, it's not straightforward, it doesn't always make sense or follow some kind of clear-cut trajectory, but even at our worst, we are still worthy of grace and we still have the potential to better ourselves. And as much as this story is about rivals to lovers romance and mariachi shenanigans, it's also very much about grief and the ways that grieving the people we've lost can sometimes overpower our memories of loving the people we've lost, and how easy it is for us to forget how loved we truly are, especially as time pushes us further and further from those precious, finite moments. So I think the story is able to strike a great balance between grief, romance, and coming of age in a really effective, impactful way, really powerful models of positive masculinity throughout the story as well. There is a slight element of magical realism that I think the story could have committed even further to, but even so, I adored this and I gave it 4.5 stars. As you might recall, this book released in the midst of the St. Martin's Press boycott, so it's been sitting on my shelf unread for more than a year, largely because of that, but because I finally got to it, I counted it towards the TBR oldie space. My picture book selection for this round was One Day in June, a story inspired by the life and activism of Marsha P. Johnson, written by Tourmaline and illustrated by Charlotte Christensen. This is a colorful, vibrant picture book that celebrates the legacy of Marsha P. Johnson, a legendary Black trans woman and activist who not only played an instrumental role in the Stonewall riots, but also paved the way for our concepts of Pride and Pride Month as we know them today. The story is told through the eyes of one of Marsha's friends, and it's connecting her life and her experiences with the ongoing need for activism in our society, especially as it pertains to Black lives and trans lives. This was a really lovely picture book. I think biographical picture books like this are so important because they make history and our understanding of historical figures so much more accessible to the next generation. They can be especially great conversation starters and also entryways for younger audiences. I think artistically and narratively, this is a beautiful tribute to the lasting legacy of Marsha P. Johnson. It goes beyond just her identity and her advocacy to really tap into her soul and her humanity, the ways she moved through the world and the ways she dreamed that others could live freely and authentically express themselves. I also like that it's told from the perspective of an old friend, because oftentimes we think of the Stonewall riots as having happened a long time ago, when it's actually fairly recent history, and there are still people who were involved or connected to those involved who are still alive and carrying on that legacy and that fight today. Like I said, I think it's great that this story doesn't pigeonhole Marsha P. Johnson as merely a Black trans woman and that it doesn't strip her down to just her identities, but there also isn't actually any explicit mention of the kinds of activism she was involved in. There are no mentions of Stonewall, and there are no mentions of her transness. I know there's a sector of educators, parents, and grown-ups who believe we shouldn't talk about those things in picture books, even obliquely, because they're quote-unquote inappropriate for young readers or too complicated for young readers, but not only do I think that's a very bad take, but I don't think it actually applies to this particular book, because there is a march for Black trans lives happening in the background. So it's not that transness can't be mentioned, it's that there's no direct connection between all these memories of Marsha with this particular cause. So kind of a confusing choice and narrative gap in my personal opinion, but I still think this is a wonderful tribute to her life and her personhood. It has a great message about showing up for other people, spreading joy, and being unapologetically ourselves, so I would still give it 4.25 stars. Again, this counted towards both the picture book prompt as well as the BIPOC nonfiction prompt. Then I listened to Best Woman by Rose Damu. Ballantine Books very kindly sent me a finished copy, and PRH Audio granted me access to the audiobook, which is read by Nikki Andress. This is an absolutely uproarious adult coming-of-age story about a Jewish trans woman named Julia, whose family's actually been pretty supportive of her transition, and she has a really great relationship with her brother who is about to get married, so much so that he has asked her to be his best woman. So now she has to leave behind her extremely queer life in New York to spend a week down in Florida for the wedding and also deal with her extended family, many of whom she hasn't really interacted with since her transition. And to make things worse, she finds out that her high school crush, Kim Cameron, is stepping in last minute to be maid of honor, which causes Julia to make a lot of questionable choices in the hopes of finally winning her heart. Content warnings for some explorations of experienced homophobia, transphobia, and racism, instances of misgendering, and some sexual content. This was perhaps the biggest surprise of the week for me. I had a good feeling about this book. I figured I would most likely enjoy it, but actually I ended up loving it so much. Family weddings always make for an entertaining story because they're always a shit show and there's so much going on. It's a very rich narrative vein to tap into, and I think the story does a great job of extracting the humor, heart, and messiness to be found in that situation. But it's also a really nuanced portrayal of transness, which I didn't really expect. The title of the story is working in two ways, because not only is Julia acting as her brother's best woman, but she's also responding to this pressure from her family and from society that if she's quote-unquote choosing to be a woman, then she better be the best woman, the most woman there ever was. The story is very much pushing back against these predominant trans narratives and stereotypes we hear over and over again that people, both cis and trans alike, use to quote-unquote justify the experience of transness. There's the born in the wrong body narrative, the I always knew I was trans narrative, the my life didn't start until I transitioned narrative, the my old self is dead to me and never existed narrative, which is not to invalidate any of those experiences if they resonate for you, but again, they often become the predominant narratives, or even the only narratives through which some people can parse transness, effectively flattening all the possibilities of what it actually means to be trans. For Julia, especially as a trans woman, she feels a lot of pressure from the people around her to be hyper-feminine, to aspire to be cis-passing, to be undeniably woman, whatever that means, because for a lot of her family and a lot of people in her life, that's the only kind of transness they understand or even tolerate. There's this assumption that everyone who transitions has the goal of being perceived as a completely different gender than the one they were assigned, which often pushes these expectations of extreme masculinity or extreme femininity to say nothing of anything between or beyond those ends of the spectrum onto trans people. There's this idea that we need to win at gender, we need to become undetectable, unclockable, or completely unrecognizable in order to be valid in our transness, which is incredibly reductive. I love that this story is pushing back against those misconceptions, that Julia doesn't view masculinity as her enemy, her failing, or something she's wiped her hands of completely. I like that she's not ashamed of her past or her childhood, that she doesn't have this disconnect between who she was and who she still is. At its heart, I feel like this story is acknowledging the complexity of being trans. There's something to be said about having people in your life who have witnessed all the different versions of your evolution throughout the years. And yes, of course, there are painful realities that come with that. But there's also something special about people who love you the same throughout all the evolutions and all the changes. It's really about Julia realizing that she doesn't have to be the ultra perfect woman in order for her transness to be real. Whatever kind of woman she wants to be is, by definition, the best woman she can be. Again, I really adored this. It was very nearly a 5-star book, but at the very end, in the epilogue, it tries really hard to make itself a romance when it's very much not a romance, so it kind of stumbled at the finish line, but I still gave this 4.75 stars. And I counted this book towards the debut space. The next book I picked up was my arc of Last First Kiss by Julian Winters. I received an e-galley from St. Martin's Griffin, and this one comes out very soon on January 27th, 2026. This is Julian's latest adult romance. It does sequentially follow the events of I Think They Love You, so if you read this book first, it will spoil what happens in that book. It is a second chance romance about a wedding planner named Jordan Carter who works for his family's upscale event planning company, and he is assigned the company's first high-profile celebrity wedding in about a decade, which he really wants to get right. The problem is that the bride's parents, who normally would be involved in all the planning aspects, are out of the country, so the bride-to-be asks her best friend to step in and help her make those choices, and that best friend, Jamie, happens to be Jordan's first kiss and longtime unrequited crush, who he recently tried to start something with, only to get decisively rejected. But of course, he's not going to let that get under his skin, and he is definitely going to pull off this wedding without a hitch. Content warnings for some references to an estranged parent-child relationship, some experienced homophobia, and some explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, one of the main characters, Jamie, is pansexual, and Jordan is questioning for a majority of the story and eventually realizes he is demisexual. This was a really fun adult romance. I love a good second chance forced proximity romance chock full of romantic shenanigans and mishaps, and this book definitely has that in spades. It's especially fun to read because of all the wedding planning happening in the story, which forces our two main characters into a lot of zany situations that are funny, unexpected, and of course hopelessly romantic. Between this book and Best Woman, it was a really great week for adult coming-of-age stories, which I think we could always use even more of. I love seeing older, more established characters still discovering new parts of themselves and still engaging in this sense of curiosity, reckoning with the fact that there's always more to learn about the world and about themselves. That's a really beautiful thing, and I love that that is this story's centerpiece. Whether it's YA or adult, one thing Julian really knows how to do is pull off a tender, sincere, thoughtful, coming-of-age storyline, and this book is no exception. I also appreciate what the story has to say about how there's no such thing as a timeline when it comes to discovering ourselves or becoming the person we're meant to be. Whether it's romance, your career, your family life, your personal goals, there's no such thing as being late when it comes to living a meaningful life and being yourself. The romantic relationship, of course, is really sweet. The two main characters definitely have chemistry and history together, and it's fun to see them bumble their way through this incredibly fraught wedding planning process. I will say there's a piece of the story involving how Jordan's bio dad sort of abandoned the family and how that's caused Jordan to become overly protective of himself and his heart because he's constantly worried about being left behind. I feel like that should have been a much more prominent piece of the story, but it ends up feeling more like a footnote. But even with that, for me, this was still solidly 4 stars. Again, because Jamie, one of the main characters, is canonically pansexual, this book counted towards the pansexual MC space. After that, I picked up my Patreon pick for the month, which just so happened to fit into one of the prompts for this round. That was the audiobook for Dear Mothman by Robin Gao, read by Danny Martinek. This is a middle grade novel in verse about a young trans boy named Noah whose best friend Lewis was also trans, but Lewis unfortunately passed away in a car accident, and now Noah is left alone in his grief. Because he and Lewis love talking about cryptids, Noah decides to start writing letters to their favorite cryptid, Mothman. At first, it's because he's curious and he wonders whether Mothman ever feels as invisible and alone as he does, but then he decides to prove that Mothman is real as part of his science fair project and becomes more and more desperate to secure some kind of proof. Content warnings for explorations of child death and grief, experienced transphobia, including dead naming, misgendering, and accidental outing, and some references to experienced bullying. Also worth noting, the main character is not only transgender, but also autistic. This is such a heart-wrenching, hard-hitting story. It's written in a way that's deceptively simple, but it's incredibly effective in its simplicity and in its sincerity, and I think it absolutely accomplishes everything it sets out to do. Obviously, this story makes no secret of being a rumination on grief and loss. It also explores complex topics like what it means to be a trans kid in this world, what it means to be closeted both out of necessity and by choice, and the struggle a lot of kids feel when it comes to considering themselves and their experiences to be good enough and real enough. I think Mothman acts as the perfect metaphor in this story, not just as a means for Noah to work through his grief, but also because he deeply relates to this cryptid's experience of being isolated, feared, misunderstood, and doubted in many ways. The reason he becomes so obsessed with procuring evidence that Mothman is undoubtedly real is because he also struggles to be seen as real to the people in his life. So he figures if people can believe in something as fantastical and outlandish as Mothman, then they'll also be able to believe in his transness. It's just a really powerful story with so many layers to it. The more you sit with it, the more effective you realize that metaphor of Mothman really is, and how valuable it is to have a story like this where the message is that things don't have to be definite or even observable to be real, and that not all questions need to have answers. Sometimes being willing to ask the question, to wonder, is the entire point. I also appreciate the story's ambiguity. It kind of leaves the question of belief up to the reader and leaves space for a lot of different interpretations, which again is also a beautiful way of considering transness. This was another book where I wouldn't change a single thing about it. I can't think of a single way it could possibly be improved. I think Robin Gao is a masterful verse novelist. I love them especially in this middle grade space, and I gave this book 5 stars. And in terms of the bingo board, of course, this book counted towards the middle grade space. This next book is a chunker I was slowly chipping away at all week long, and I was able to finish it on the very last day of the readathon. That was All the White Spaces by Allie Wilkes. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Scott Turner Schofield. This is a dark survival thriller with some horror elements to it as well. It's also historical fiction because it's set just after the conclusion of World War I. The main character, Jonathan, is a trans man whose brothers were both killed in the war, and his grief spurs him to finally present as a man and run away from his family to stow away aboard an expedition bound for the Arctic. But things quickly go south, no pun intended, when the expedition gets stranded in Antarctica and they have to take to the land in order to survive. And if that wasn't treacherous enough, something deadly is stalking the surviving members of this expedition, preying on their deepest desires and darkest fears, and luring them off into the wilderness one by one. Content warnings for explorations of sibling death, child death, and grief, some references to war and war-related PTSD, references to off-page animal death, brief non-graphic references to suicide ideation, some use of ableist language, and graphic depictions of gore, blood, injury, violence, and gun violence. This is an intense, harrowing, desolate story. I think the structure and pacing of the story, while perhaps not the most successful or efficient, is at least very purposeful in the sense that the long, drawn-out nature of the story perfectly echoes the vast, endless, overwhelming stretches of nothingness that the characters are having to contend with on the page. I think the fact that this is a survival story specifically also works really well with what the story is trying to explore thematically, especially because survival scenarios often force people into extreme modes of toxic masculinity, which is an especially pressing conflict for the story's trans main character to have to navigate. There's a lot of macho bullshit that comes up as the remaining members of this expedition are fighting for their lives in this extremely remote environment. Everyone's trying to prove that they're strong enough, tough enough, man enough to survive no matter what it takes, no matter what kind of choices they have to make, which is especially fraught for Jonathan, who is fighting to survive not just as a person, but also as a trans man. So I found the story's elements of survival horror to be really effective because it allows the story to explore the question of manhood and what it means to be a man in really seamless, organic ways. And it also just feels like a natural extension of Jonathan's inner conflict because as a trans man, he's already fighting to survive in so many ways. So I think all the pieces of the story work really well together, including the time period during which the story is set right after the end of World War I, because the lingering grief and trauma from the war is very much impacting the characters and informing the ways they react to their environment and the choices they ultimately make. So again, thematically and aesthetically, I think everything about the story hangs together pretty well. The atmosphere is also incredibly immersive. But for me, I found myself wishing the story was a bit more tightly paced. It feels a little too drawn out. Some things start feeling a bit repetitive, and I think by the end you definitely feel the story's page count a little bit too much. So because of that, I ended up giving this one 3.75 stars. Originally, I thought I would read this for the seasonal prompt because it's very cold, very wintry, but I ultimately decided it fit better in the historical fiction space. Penultimately, I read my arc of Nobody's Baby by Olivia Waite. I was sent a review copy by Tor.com, and this one comes out on March 10th, 2026. This is the second book in a cozy sci-fi mystery series. It's set in space aboard the HMS Fairweather, where humans are being transported from Earth to a distant planet. And to ensure the passengers survive the long journey, the ship uses a kind of technology where the passengers' memories and genome are stored inside books. That way, if someone passes away or if there's some kind of accident, passengers can be fully restored using the information stored in those books. The main character, Dorothy Gentleman, is one of the ship's detectives, and even though becoming pregnant has been made a medical impossibility, at least for the duration of the journey, an infant has been mysteriously left on her nephew's doorstep. So the question is, who produced this child? How were they able to get around the restrictions? Why did they abandon him? And why did they trust his care to Dorothy's nephew out of all the other passengers on the ship? Content warnings for some explorations of child abandonment, brief non-graphic references to childbirth, some instances of death, and some explorations of memory loss. I am loving this novella series so much. The core group of characters are so incredibly endearing and fun to read about. I love this sort of generationship and its ethos that Olivia Waite has imagined, and I think this is another really smart, elegant, self-contained mystery story. I think I might have said something similar about the first book, but I love the way the author approaches mystery in this series. It feels very classic in some ways because Dorothy is kind of your textbook detective who's very independent, very quirky, very astute, but mostly I love that each mystery is compelling and propulsive, but also relatively low stakes. There's not really any kind of mortal danger driving the story forward as you might find in any other kind of mystery, but also there doesn't really have to be because instead there's a feeling of moral urgency as Dorothy's motivation for solving this case is to better protect the other passengers aboard the ship. And because this series takes place aboard an interesting generation ship, it gives the story opportunities to explore what society and social norms might look like in the future. Because this is a fixed population being regenerated over and over again along this journey, the story is able to interrogate the phenomena of memory, permanence, and the indelible marks we make on each other and the spaces we occupy just by virtue of existing. So I really enjoyed this overall, and I cannot wait for hopefully many more installments in this series. I will say there was a side character slash potential love interest introduced towards the end of the first book who I was really hoping would be much more involved in this sequel than she actually is, so that was a bit of a missed opportunity in my opinion, but I still gave this a solid 4.25 stars. I counted this book towards two prompts. First, the detective prompt, for obvious reasons, but also the bookish prompt, because even though the ship's library of memory books isn't as central to the story as it is in the first book, it's still very much an important piece. And last but certainly not least, I was able to squeeze in my review copy of One Word, Six Letters by Adib Karam. I was kindly sent a bound manuscript by Henry Holt & Company, and this one comes out on March 17th, 2026. This is Adib's return to YA. It's a hard-hitting contemporary dual POV story about two teenage boys at the same school who aren't friends and don't really know each other very well, but are deeply impacted by the same incident. One of the characters, Dayton, was dared by one of his classmates to shout a queerphobic slur at a visiting author during a school-wide event, which he is not only punished for, but it also causes him to lose a lot of his friends. The other character, Farshid, is an Iranian-American teenager who is not only battling with body image issues and self-confidence, but also questioning his sexuality. And even though he and Dayton aren't friends, he can't help but wonder whether this incident and all the fallout and ongoing discussions surrounding it are somehow pointed at him. Content warnings for experienced homophobia, racism, and xenophobia, references to bullying and use of queerphobic slurs, references to some use of misogynistic language, and some explorations of internalized fatphobia and possible body dysmorphia, including descriptions of restricted eating habits and excessive exercise. This is a really short, focused novel, but I think it's extremely effective in what it's trying to accomplish. I love that the story is told from a dual POV, especially with two characters who couldn't be more different from each other and aren't really connected to each other in any kind of direct or meaningful way, because it really helps to show the far-reaching implications of what some people might mistakenly call an isolated incident. Especially with bigotry, especially with oppressive ideologies, especially with queerphobia, there is no such thing as an isolated incident. These ideas and experiences don't exist in a vacuum. They have a way of rippling outwards, impacting an environment at a very high level, and impacting people who may not even be directly involved in ways you might not expect. So I think the dual POV does a great job of exploring those far-reaching far-reaching consequences while also affording both characters a lot of complexity and nuance. And because both points of view are told in the second person, it forces the reader into the shoes of both the perpetrator and the victim, and shows how there's a lot more depth to both of them than you might think. Especially with Dayton's point of view, I think it's really smart for the story to almost force the reader into a place of discomfort, of occupying the mind of this young, ignorant character who doesn't see himself as a bad person, doesn't understand why any of this is a big deal, and it really forces you to sit with that character as they grow and contend with the consequences of their actions. And again, I think the way the story is framed and structured is incredibly effective because it forces you to wrestle with the fact that there's no clear-cut delineation between good and bad. No one is entirely good or entirely bad. We all contain shades of both. We all have the capacity to make bad choices or make mistakes, and you really get a chance to see both characters making mistakes and making amends. And above all, I really respect what this story has to say about the difference between punitive punishment and justice. Especially in this day and age, and especially for young people, so many of us are quick to quote-unquote cancel someone when they make a mistake, or write them off entirely as someone who can never be redeemed. But that's not actually a true reflection of how life or how growth works. And this story is asking us to think about what it might look like to instead center restorative justice. Dayton has to go through all of these public forms of punishment after what he does. He gets in-school suspension, he has to write the author an apology, he has to X, Y, and Z to comply with the school's equity policies, but does doing any of those things, does getting dropped by his friends and marked as a social pariah actually help him to reckon with the impact of his actions? Does it actually help him become a better person? Not really. True justice isn't just about going through the motions, performing shame or remorse, going on an apology tour, checking off boxes on some list. It's so much deeper than that. It's not just acknowledging that you did a bad thing, but rather about what you're going to do and continue doing in order to better yourself. So I really value that as one of the story's central themes. I think it's so important to show young readers especially that you don't need to be friends with everyone, you don't need to agree with everyone, but we do still need to do right by each other, and we do still have some level of responsibility to each other in the sense that we can hold each other to higher standards, even and especially when we fall short. I thought this was an absolutely triumphant return to YA for Adib. It's very different from the YA he's written in the past, but it's no less impactful and thought-provoking. I do wish it was a little bit longer because I really love the concluding sentiment. I just think it needed a bit more runway to fully land, if that makes sense, but that's a very small note, and I still gave this 4.5 stars. I also counted this book towards 2 prompts. First, I used it for the make your own prompt space, which I chose to make stretch goal because I finished all my priority books and was able to squeeze this one in at the end. And because the title is more than 16 letters, I also counted it for the 16 letters prompt. I could also technically put this in the debut space because it's Adib's first book being published through a Macmillan imprint. Before we take a look at my final bingo board, I will give the quick disclaimer that you're only going to see one book occupying each space I checked off. For example, Hollow Magic, Best Woman, and One Word 6 Letters could all count towards the debut space, but only one of them will be pictured because I only need one of them to fulfill the prompt. So with that in mind, here is my final bingo board. I checked off every prompt except for 2, and I made a total of, I believe, 7 bingos. I made both diagonals, 2 vertical bingos in the last 2 columns, 2 horizontal bingos in the bottom 2 rows, and technically 3 additional bingos because I checked off all of the yellow boxes, all of the light blue boxes, and all of the dark blue boxes. So there you have it. Those are all the books I read for the Queer Lit Read-a-thon. It was a very busy reading week, but also an incredibly fulfilling one as well. If you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, let me know, or feel free to share what you read during this past round of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.